Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. I'm Josh Cornwell, the host of this program, and today we're presenting part 3 in The Adventure of the Empty House, a Sherlock Holmes mystery from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Thought dead for 3 years following his final confrontation with the criminal mastermind Moriarty, Holmes has suddenly emerged in London. His shocking reappearance before his old friend Dr. Watson seems connected in some way with the inexplicable murder of the young nobleman Ronald Adair, killed by a soft-nosed revolver bullet in an empty, locked room. As we return to the narrative, Holmes continues to explain what he's been up to for the past 3 years to his old friend Dr. Watson. I listened with incredulity as my dear friend, who I had thought dead these last 3 years, told me what remained of his amazing story.
I had only one confidant, my brother, Mycroft. I owe you many apologies, my dear Watson, but it was all important that it should be thought I was dead, and it is quite certain that you would not have written so convincingly about my unhappy end had you not thought it was true. Several times during the last 3 years I took up my pen to write you, but always I feared that your affectionate regard for me might tempt you into an indiscretion which would betray my secret. For that same reason I turned away from you this evening when you upset my books, for I was in danger at the time, and any show of surprise and emotion upon your part might have drawn attention to my identity and led to the most deplorable and irreparable results. As to Mycroft, I had to confide in him in order to obtain the money I needed to support my travels.
But 3 years. Holmes, whatever compelled you to keep up the deception for so long? My dear wife, Mary, bless her soul, went to her grave believing you killed.
Let me assure you, my dear friend, that at no moment was it more difficult for me to maintain my deception than in those days just after I learned from Mycroft of her condition. Events in London did not go so well as I had hoped, for the trial of Moriarty's gang left 2 of its most dangerous members, my own deadliest enemies, at liberty. I therefore travelled for 2 years in Tibet and amused myself by visiting Lhasa and spending some days with the head lama.
I was utterly lost after Mary's death. To suffer first the death of my closest friend, and to so soon after experience the loss of my wife. And all this time you were in Tibet?
Not only Tibet. You may have read of the remarkable exploits of a Norwegian explorer named Sigerson, but I am sure that it never occurred to you that you were reading news of your friend. Then I passed through Persia, I looked in at Mecca, and paid a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum. Returning to France, I spent some months researching coal tar derivatives in a laboratory in the south. Having concluded this to my satisfaction and learning that only one of my enemies was now left in London, I was about to return when my travels were hastened by news of this very remarkable Park Lane mystery, which not only appealed to me on its own merits, but which seemed to offer a more personal opportunity as well. I came at once to London, called in on Baker Street, threw Mrs. Hudson into violent hysterics, and found that Mycroft had preserved my rooms and my papers exactly as they had always been. So it was, my dear Watson, that at 2 o'clock today I found myself in my old armchair, in my own old rooms, and only wishing that I could have seen my old friend Watson in the other chair which he had so often occupied.
Such was the remarkable narrative I listened to on that April evening, a narrative which would have been utterly unbelievable to me had it not been confirmed by the actual sight of the tall, spare figure and the keen, eager face which I had never thought to see again. We spoke a little more of my own sad bereavement, the loss of my dear wife, and his sympathy was shown in his manner more than in his words.
Work is the best antidote to sorrow, my dear Watson, and I have a piece of work for both of us tonight, which, if we can bring it to a successful conclusion, will in itself justify a man's life on this planet.
In vain, I begged him to tell me more.
You will hear and see enough before morning. We have 3 years of the past to discuss. Let that suffice until 9:30 when we start upon the notable adventure of the empty house.
It was indeed like old times when, that evening, I found myself seated beside Holmes in a hansom cab, my revolver in my pocket, and the thrill of adventure in my heart. Holmes was cold and stern and silent. As the gleam of the street lamps flashed upon his austere features, I saw that his brows were drawn down in thought and his thin lips compressed. I knew not what wild beast we were about to hunt down in the dark jungle of criminal London, but I was well assured, from the bearing of this master huntsman, that the adventure was a most grave one, while the sardonic smile which occasionally broke through his ascetic gloom boded little good for the object of our quest. I had imagined that we were bound for Baker Street, but Holmes stopped the cab at the corner of Cavendish Square. I observed that as he stepped out, he gave a most searching glance to the left and right, and that at every street corner he took the utmost care to assure that we were not followed. Our route was certainly an unusual one. Holmes's knowledge of the byways of London was extraordinary, and on this occasion he passed rapidly and with an assured step through a network of mews and stables, the very existence of which I had never known. We emerged at last into a small road lined with old, gloomy houses. Here he turned swiftly down a narrow passage, passed through a wooden gate into a deserted yard, and then opened with a key the back door of a house. We entered together, and he closed it behind us. The place was pitch dark, but it was evident to me that it was an empty house. Our feet creaked and crackled over the bare planking, and my outstretched hand touched a wall from which the paper was hanging in ribbons. Holmes's cold, thin fingers closed round my wrist and led me forward down a long hall until I dimly saw a murky light over a door. Here Holmes turned suddenly to the right, and we found ourselves in a large, square, empty room, heavily shadowed in the corners, but faintly lit in the center by the lights of the street outside. There was no lamp, and the window was thick with dust. My companion put his hand upon my shoulder.
Do you know where we are?
Surely that is Baker Street.
Exactly. We are in Camden House, across the street from our old quarters.
But why are we here?
Because it has such an excellent view of that picturesque property. Might I trouble you, my dear Watson, to draw a little closer to the window, taking every precaution not to show yourself, and then look up at our old rooms, the starting point of so many of your little fairy tales. We will see if my 3 years of absence have entirely taken away my power to surprise you.
I crept forward and looked across at the familiar window. As my eyes fell upon it, I gave a gasp and a cry of amazement. The blind was down, and a strong light was burning in the room. The shadow of a man who was seated in a chair within was thrown in hard black outline upon the luminous screen of the window. There was no mistaking the poise of the head, the squareness of the shoulders, the sharpness of the features. The face was turned half round, and the effect was that of one of those black silhouettes which our grandparents loved to frame. It was a perfect reproduction of Holmes. So amazed was I that I threw out my hand to make sure that the man himself was standing beside me. He was quivering with silent laughter.
Well?
Good heavens. It is marvelous.
I trust that age does not wither my infinite variety. It is really rather like me, is it not?
I should be prepared to swear it was you.
The credit goes to the French artist in Grenoble, who spent some days in doing the moulding. It is a bust in wax. The rest I arranged myself during my visit to Baker Street this afternoon.
But why?
Because, my dear Watson, I had the strongest possible reason for wishing certain people to think I was there when I was really elsewhere.
And you thought the rooms were watched?
I knew that they were watched.
By whom?
By my old enemies, Watson. By the charming society whose leader lies in the Reichenbach Falls. You must remember that they knew, and only they knew, that I was still alive. Sooner or later they believed that I might come back to my rooms. They watched them continuously, and this morning they saw me arrive.
How do you know?
Because I recognized their sentinel when I glanced out of my window. He is a harmless enough fellow, Parker by name, a garroter by trade, and a remarkable performer of the jaw harp. I care nothing for him, but I care a great deal for the much more formidable person behind him, the bosom friend of Moriarty, the man who dropped the rocks over the cliff, the most cunning and dangerous criminal in London. That is the man who is after me tonight, Watson, and that is the man who is quite unaware that we are after him.
Holmes and Watson lie in wait in an empty house across the street from their old apartments at 221B Baker Street, waiting for an unknown enemy to strike. Who is it that Holmes means to catch by this elaborate deception? And what connection, if any, might they have with the mysterious murder of Ronald Adair in the locked room at the house on Park Lane? Find out tomorrow evening in Part 4 of The Adventure of the Empty House here on BeFM Drama.